Clearly, the narratives around AI, be they drawn from literature or film or the media, are something of a force to contend with, and in particular when it comes to harnessing AI for good. So how do we contend with these narratives? How do we address the mainly dystopian fears that they often create and capitalize upon? And what better narratives might be created, and how? To join me to explore these questions, I have three wonderful panelists: Arohi, Jain, Rajvanshi, who's the head of strategy at the Future Society, an economist with a passionate commitment to using AI for social good; Davies, who's senior editor at the fantastically thoughtful Aeon magazine and formerly the technology and innovation correspondent at the Financial Times; and Dr. Claire Craig, director of science policy at the Royal Society and also our external collaborator on the AI. Is my mic still on? Yep. Please join me in welcoming my guests to the stage.
This is rather ungraceful.
Oh, don't believe in steps
No.
at CogX, I don't think. Right, brilliant. So we're going to start with, they're all small questions, aren't they? But Sally, what are the kind of predominant narratives about AI that we find in contemporary media? Cantor and Stephen have given us a kind of good history. What do we encounter now?
I mean, I think a theme that's come up in the course of the conversations the CFI has been running about narratives is this idea of kind of utopia and dystopia, this notion that either all our problems will be gone or that we'll be living in some sort of hellish landscape. So I think, broadly speaking, a lot of the narratives kind of fit to that dichotomy. And I think something that we've been talking about and hoping to explore is perhaps there's some kind of middle road that we can tread. Instead of utopia, which means no place, dystopia, which means bad place, maybe there's something like a utopia, EU, sort of from Aristotle's eudaimonia, a good place. But a good place doesn't mean a place that doesn't have problems, nor does it mean a place where everything is fixed, that it's some way in which we can encounter the challenges and overcome them.
And why do we think, open it to the panelists, that the predominant stories are negative ones?
I think quite simply, it's easier to imagine an extreme rather than something that's more balanced. Of course, dystopian narratives, they embody some of our very real fears, such as loss of human agency, identity, control, which must be paid attention to, but it's very easy to have them amplified, especially with the layer of Hollywood movies and productions.
Claire, what's your narrative that you love to hate?
Well, I was thinking about the dystopia point, and my interest in particular is how these stories affect the public environment, and ultimately particularly, for example, the policy and regulatory one. And dystopia can easily take you into the fear of, for example, massive loss of jobs, massive disruption. And the question is, how do you create a public dialogue that is kind of balanced? Because clearly there is going to be disruption, but equally if all the stories that are informing the wider context are the really bad dystopias, you can get inflated fears about the scale, and then it's really difficult to get kind of evidence well argued cases. The other thing about dystopias is, by definition, they're kind of all-enveloping. They are chaos, they are dark and terrible. And actually, we're going to create the future by making lots of individual different decisions. What we decide in terms of cars, or what we decide in terms of houses or healthcare, and how we use AI in these very specific. That will be the incremental way by which we create the future, and that's a kind of different set of stories.
I'm picking up on Stephen and Cantor's last point. Why is it in Western narratives in particular, do you think, that we have ended up at this kind of extreme of kind of fear, rather than, for instance, welcoming robots or seeing them as friends or lovers even? Arohi?
I think, what I mentioned, there are fears of, how society, we're picking up on our the way we see social structures, the way we see demographic movements. Deferring. We would like machines to do work for us, but not kind of run our lives in a complementary manner, but also not give them too much power. So we can't figure out a balanced way of approaching the human-machine relationship. And I also think they embody, a lot of the dynamics of the rise of artificial intelligence, which is indeed, the data economy, the platform economy, sharing economy, social media. And those spheres we see going very viral and very rapidly reaching all sects of society, and they need to be paid attention to.
Is there anything that you think is being missed out in the contemporary narrative? So we've talked about dystopia, utopia, but is there anything else that they're not tapping into that we should be talking about?
I mean, I think perhaps there's this sort of, to answer your question somewhat obliquely, but and also to pick up on the last one, is that I think something we sort of have to talk about the history of these narratives, and as indeed Steve Rincanter did, and something that's, I think, interesting about, for example, a comparison between Japanese narratives and Western narratives is there might be something to the arc of Western intellectual history about the way we talk about matter and the material world and the natural world. So when I speak to Japanese technologists, I'm struck by how the Japanese intellectual history is very influenced by Shinto philosophy and the notion that matter can sort of have a spirit, have an agency. It doesn't mean it's the same as human agency, whereas the kind of modern Western tradition tends to treat matter as something that's inert and fundamentally distinct from the human condition. And so we sort of don't quite know how to deal with it now that in a way we're creating AI and reinvigorating it with a sense of agency, but we've been so used to thinking of matter as something we're distinct from and something we can control. So I don't know if now, essentially maybe there's a shift that we need to undertake where we've typically thought in kind of mechanistic terms, and now we perhaps need to go back into thinking in sort of more ecological or entangled terms, systems thinking, where you don't just have a series of interrelated components that produces a larger mechanism, but actually that whole system exercises kind of downward causation on its underlying parts. So perhaps it's not about controlling AI or controlling robots, but us existing in a kind of ecological relationship with these creations.
You make an interesting distinct or equivalence there between kind of AI and or robots. Mm-hmm. And obviously in kind of all these big blockbusters, it's primarily embodied AI that we see, because if you're going to make a film, you need bodies. Is that a problem, that it's the embodied AI that's kind of driving a lot of these popular stories?
I think there are two problems with the focus on embodiment. One of them is that, as Sally was saying, the things that matter over time are going to be deeply distributed. And
you just
sorry,
keep your chin down slightly.
Keep my chin down.
Sorry, the mic's not picking up.
No, I can't do this. The big changes are going to be distributed, and distributed, even just saying distributed or systems thinking sounds boring compared with, humanoid or robot. But if you take autonomous vehicles, it's still the case that a huge amount of the discussion is about, say, the car or the vehicle, the person in it. Whereas if you look at the history, say, of cities over the last 100 years in the West, they're completely transformed by the introduction of the original car. So the systemic changes that autonomous vehicles are likely to change are going to be more significant for health and life and wealth and air quality and other things. So that's one thing. The other is that the embodiment tends to take us to the humanoid, and then we get deeply entangled in what we mean by intelligence, because we just can't help equating the word intelligence with human intelligence, because that's all we've ever previously really known. And that's just such a misnomer for all the things we ought to be talking about, which are different types of deep intelligence and deep and narrow intelligence. Again, it's the danger is just not talking about the things that matter most.
Yeah. Arohi, you're nodding.
One of my absolute pet peeves is the anthropomorphization of artificial intelligence. The classic example I give is how similar are our virtual personal assistants, Siri, Alexa, to the physical human body. I mean, Google Duplex is again a good example. It's really not about creating human 2.0.
Yeah. I have a pet peeve with digital assistants and the fact that primarily they are female voices. I asked my Alexa the other night, I said, what gender are you? And she said, I am gendered as female. And I said, why are you gendered as female? I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. And I think a lot of developers don't know the answer to that. There hasn't been any thought given to the kind of stereotypes about female servitude that are being perpetuated by gendering these non-gendered, non-embodied AI as female.
But I was going to say, I mean, I think you sort of touch on something that's really important in terms of an element of these narratives that we're not really looking at, which is we're much more inclined to kind of look at the far future and look at science fiction scenarios. Somebody said to me the other day, the reason everyone's obsessed with these far future scenarios is they can't really be proved wrong. So there's a sense in which you're not accountable when you make prognostications about the far future. But I think that there's a huge resource that we don't typically tap, which is instead of these hypothetical endpoints, why don't we talk about historical shifts in the way we've conceived of consciousness, intelligence, bodies. I mean, we've had huge social justice movements that have radically shifted the parameters of what it means to be human, and why don't we look at the conditions that allowed that to take place, and that might actually provide a resource for how we need to undertake this shift now when we're building these AI creatures and devices. But we don't look at it because somehow history isn't sexy.
That's very interesting. So rather than learning from science fictional and speculative thinking, we need to turn the camera the other way and learn from the past. Can you give a specific example of a kind of historical moment that might help us now?
Well, I mean, I think, for example, I think something as simple as emancipation. I mean, there's some really interesting readings on Frankenstein, for example, which argue, I think correctly, that the notion of Frankenstein's monster is very much engaged with conversations in the 19th century about slavery, and this idea that one of the great fears of emancipation in the antebellum US was this notion of we've treated people so badly, what is going to happen when we free them, and what are they going to do to us implicitly, the sort of white man. And so when you see Frankenstein's monster sort of going on a rampage and committing all these terrible acts, it's the fear of when you've acculturated a group of humans to behave in a certain way, when you've treated them so badly, what's going to happen. So I think that there are ways in which you can look at essentially people of colour for a large part of modern history have not been considered full humans. Now, of course, today I think hopefully all of us in this room would obviously accept that was manifestly unjust, and maybe we need to look at that example as to how we might start thinking about what kinds of agency and moral status do we need to grant to these devices as they advance.
Now, I'm with one of my other hats, a scholar of literature and film. So, my professional work is driven by an absolute belief in the importance of stories and the power that they have. But I understand, or I don't understand, but I believe that is not a shared opinion with the whole world. So, Claire, for the skeptics in our audience, why do stories matter? Why do narratives matter? Are they not just things that people make up, that are fiction, and they bear no relevance to the real world at all?
So there are all sorts of different reasons why they matter, and different stories matter to different groups at different times. But the fundamental is that they determine what we pay attention to, what as individuals we pay attention to. So essentially, because of the deep intertwining between kind of cognitive systems and the formation of memory and of language and stories, the stories determine what we notice. They determine, in some sense, what emotional colour comes around. So, I mean, I work most of the time with physical scientists who understandably want to talk about facts, but every fact, every number has a story behind it. So there's an entanglement of the evidence and of emotions, and the stories are what create that intertwining, if you like. And then they're very communicable. So some of the work we did was looking at what perhaps we could learn about how to have well-founded public discussions on AI from other technologies. And if you take, for example, genetic modification of plants and animals, one of the issues there is that stories about the safety, about fear to do with safety of those kinds of technologies essentially came to dominate over others about what might have been the benefits and indeed the risks, but the more distributed risks. And that then has kind of influenced the policy environment. So they matter in that sense, but they matter at a deeply personal. I feel like I'm fading in and out. Also, and that's my final thing, they also can inspire. And so, I mean, any of us who worked with a lot of AI scientists know the language of science fiction is very much one that's often used. You can't run a workshop on the subject without it coming up. So there's a kind of internal language and shared group think around it, which is another wholly other aspect. Thank you.
There's an interesting pattern emerging, which is that people coming to this session might expected us to be talking about science fiction, but actually that we can learn from the historical past, and we can learn from other emergent technologies that, we may be reinventing the AI wheel, but, there have been other disruptive technologies that have existed in the past, from climate change science to nuclear science to GM, and that they have had their own experience of controlling or encountering those narratives. Arohi, you're from an economics background, which is about numbers and facts and figures. Are you a believer in the power of narratives, and have you encountered kind of resistance to that in the environments you move in?
Absolutely a believer in narratives. I think science, technology, and society sort of operate in a dynamic and evolving cycle of co-production. So there's influence and confluence between all of them. And we can definitely learn from, even the invention of the hand loom and what it did to much of the working class in the UK. And there was so much disruption that happened. And it was, but, there were new jobs created and society changed. And so as technology develops and evolves, it changes our societal values and how we associate with each other, which in turn, of course, guides policy. Once our values and policies are redefined, that again shapes technology. So imaginaries are a great way to build an inclusive and experiential way in understanding what our citizens' values, hopes, fears are regarding technology, and then bringing in the developers and the technologists to create technology that is reflective of those values, so that the two are really aligned. And I think public discourse is extremely important, especially at the global level, because AI is a global phenomenon in its dynamics and its impact. And so, as you were saying earlier, Sally, that you need to have a confrontation of what values are and alignment between, say, Japan, China, Russia, the West, include, Africa and Afrofuturism dialogue. There's some great narratives in that region that we just don't hear about because our media is very Western-centric.
Well, we're hoping to have an AI narratives workshop on the African continent at some point, so that would hopefully we can bring those to light more. Is policy making a form of storytelling? I'm looking at our policy experts on the end there.
Of course, just like most of life, the way that public debates on other sciences have gone is a mix of the stories that are kind of full of emotional resonance and personal meaning, and those that are about the kind of sorry, I'm being gesticulated. I don't know what to do. Am I audible?
Yeah, just hold it slightly higher to your mouth. There we go.
So basically, politics runs on both the heart and the head, if you like. And one of the so getting them both right really matters. One of the things is, can you pick stories that illustrate deep truths rather than act as kind of lightning rods that distract people to talking about stuff that maybe is easier and more fun to talk about, as opposed to the really hard stuff. And again, if you use GM as an example, in a sense, quite a lot of it ended up being about safety in a kind of quite narrow sense, when what mattered was actually what does this mean for power and control, for the land, for global capitalism, bigger topics that are much harder to talk about. And sometimes with AI, we did at the Royal Society, we did a report on machine learning, and inevitably it had the Terminator picture. It's distracting. And it's fine as a kind of very entry point, but it's not fine if these are the deep stories that become the basis of the debate. And I think the particular risk at the moment is around jobs and work and what AI in various forms means there.
So, yes, go ahead.
To add to that, I would say, learning from the nuclear example, one of the reasons why industry players in the earlier half of the century absolutely killed themselves in the nuclear industry was because they didn't own up to the risks and the fears that people had. So being cognizant of those is incredibly important if we want to manage and develop the AI revolution.
Okay, so we've ticked that box. Everybody knows now you need to think about the stories that are told about AI and confront them and accept their power. Sally, how do we go about changing those stories?
So I think the first thing we have to do is something that's emerged is this notion that there are certain deep truths that then need to be communicated better, and some of the tropes that we're using are not fit for purpose. But I think there's another point to be made, which is my view is that narratives aren't just representative of what's happening, they actually co-create our realities. And I think one of the real challenges is that technical and scientific knowledge has proved to be incredibly powerful as a mechanism for us to understand our world, to control it, to predict it. But it's not the only theory of knowledge, and that I think even scientists and philosophers of science have shown this in many regards. I mean, scientists bring narratives to their work. I mean, when you come up with your prior, when you're trying to test a hypothesis, where does that come from? Why test anything? There's got to be a purpose in mind. So I think narratives are actually deeply imbricated in the scientific process, even if some technicians don't often acknowledge that. So, you know, I think we need to be very aware of the way that narratives are actually shaping realities. An example that doesn't come from AI, of course, is some of the early research in evolutionary psychology and how gender biased it was, that you'd be, you know, people would sort of go to study fruit fly behaviour with the presumption that women must be incredibly protective of their genetic resource, and that all of a sudden you have this theory about the promiscuous male and the coy female based on what scientists were bringing to the way fruit flies would, you know, walk around in a petri dish. So I think we shouldn't be so hubristic as to think we're not operating under similar biases right now. And so in terms of the world we're actually creating with those narratives, just being really humble and interrogating ourselves, and not just presuming. I think another aspect of this is a lot of people working within AI are very frustrated by these narratives, but they sort of already think they have the answers, and it's just a question of kind of, we've got AI, we've got to kind of sell it the right way. And my view of the matter is that we need to allow AI to sort of, the narratives around AI to be co-created with an audience. So it's maybe not narratives so much as scripts from which we can then improvise, and there needs to be a kind of feedback process. So if you're seeing Terminator images, if those speak to people, instead of just saying they're unhelpful, we need to kind of ask, well, why do they appeal to people? What sort of fears are they relating to? How can we feed that back into the process in terms of the technologies we're building?
Actually, so we did a similar exercise with our global civic debate, where we, instead of leaning towards dystopia or, you know, playing on those fears, we gave our audience, which was comprised of scientists, technologists, citizens, policymakers, academics, the whole range, and global as well. So we had it available in 5 languages: Chinese, Japanese, French, English, and Russian, with the idea that, you know, you give them a small cue of, it's year 2050 on January 17. I sit here by my window reading my book, and then they write their own narrative of what it's like to live in an AI-driven futures. And we had some amazing submissions on how the elderly can become a more active part of our society and actually be seen as valuable contributors rather than a burden, which I think in Western societies is a big problem, and how going to school will change, or what's the first thing you do in the morning versus the last thing that you do in the morning, and the different interactions we have with machines. So, and then, you know, analyzing, you know, what are people's hopes, and really building then technology that are based on those to create step change.
Brilliant. That's a wonderful example of a kind of practical initiative to start generating more positive stories. Claire, have you got any ideas about how the kind of public discourse about AI could be steered in perhaps more beneficial ways?
It's dangerous territory.
Yes, I know.
Okay. And I think any attempt to work out what the narrative in some instance should be and then impose it is clearly doomed to failure, actually. The main learning that we found doing some quite extensive public dialogue with scientists working with members of the public of very different backgrounds, but it was usually a couple of days, was how context-specific the discussions became, how really nuanced and thoughtful, but also context-specific, and ultimately never about the technology in a kind of hardcore sense, always about who's in control, whose values are at play in this. So even we had some near-term scenarios in doctor's surgery or classroom, and so on. And once people have got the kind of a general sense of how a technology might, in broad terms, work, which they can get really quickly, then they're more interested in the context. It's the who, why, what, who are they? And that, I think, then that's the main insight from dialogues based on today's technologies, but we could do more perhaps to bring that into thinking about the kind of the narratives about the kind of slightly nearer term but still in the future technologies.
Yeah, drawing kind of another analogy, one of the ways I've started to think about AI is a bit like the kind of the word cancer. So cancer has become this kind of hold-all for actually a range of very quite different and specific diseases that target different parts of the body in different ways and affect or influence the functioning of the liver in one way or the function of the heart. And I wonder if AI has itself become this kind of hegemonic narrative that's actually the problem, that we need to kind of stop thinking about AI and start thinking about purpose-specific technologies. And if we could have stories about those, we might be able to start moving forwards in some interesting ways. I want to move towards closing up by bringing in some practical examples. So I would like each panelist to give us an AI narrative that should be consigned to the burning fires of hell, or that weird hot pit that eats the Terminator in the Terminator 2, and an AI narrative that you think everybody here should go away and read or watch. Do you need some thinking time? Shall I give mine first?
Yes.
So, Burning Fires of Hell, Ex Machina. You can argue with that about me with that later. And everyone should go away and read a wonderful science fiction author called M. John Harrison, who's one of the most interesting thinkers, I think, about distributed artificial intelligence that I've ever read. And he's got a wonderful series of books known as the Kefahuchi Trilogy, which I would thoroughly recommend. Has that given you some thinking time?
Well, you've slightly stolen mine because, I'll say Ex Machina because I remember the Harvard historian Jill Lepore, she described Ex Machina in a series of other science fiction productions about AI at the time as kind of asking two fundamental questions, which is, can men reproduce without women, and are women human? And actually, when I start to think about how many films about AI ask those questions and how disturbing it is that those are our preoccupations, so I would definitely second you in consigning Ex Machina to the bin. The narrative, I don't quite know whether this is a narrative, but it's certainly been most influential in my thinking about AI, which is the biologist, theorist, feminist philosopher Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, which is a very strange piece of writing from the 1980s, but it is, I think, a really extraordinary example of how to think differently, and particularly how to think about the nature-culture, nature-technology divide in ways that sort of don't fall prey to a lot of these dualisms that we typically think of.
Brilliant. Arohi.
For me, I would burn Blade Runner.
The original one?
No, the second one.
Okay, all right.
It was
I'll allow that, yeah.
far too extremist, far too dystopian. And the one that I'd recommend is a movie called Robot and Frank. I absolutely love the depiction of how the robot comes into Frank's life and the interaction, the very comedic interaction that picks up on the subtleties of being human. Absolutely love it.
Brilliant. Claire?
So, believe it or not, I would have said Ex Machina.
We have consensus on that one.
I'm not going to. I'll be a little bit more provocative, I think, actually, on reflection, and say Data from Star Trek Next Generation.
Has got to go to hell.
Well, that's a bit harsh.
I didn't mean to quite come out as that.
Now you've said it. That's the point. He's such an attractive character.
What's your problem?
My problem is simply that he's too attractive as a kind of trope, as an idea. I mean,
right.
He's so charming and fascinating, and the endless moral complexities that maybe he should be consigned to hell, because it's easy to see that the Terminator's the wrong story to be constantly talking about, but actually maybe Data is just as illusory. I'll move very quickly on because I feel on dodgy ground. And there's an author called John Varley, who isn't normally thought of as a kind of AI type author, but a lot of his work combines thinking about organic and genetic technologies and artificial intelligence. He wrote a thing called the Gaia trilogy, which is essentially about a kind of normal kind of, thrill and peril plot, but inside an entire being that is a half-mad god. So it's very definitely distributed intelligence. And his short stories are really interesting because they combine organics as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I hope you've gone away with your thoughts provoked and some films and books for your bedside table reading list. There is no Meet the Speaker session after this talk, because if you want to meet the speakers, you're going to have to come do some work for us. We are holding immediately after this a workshop on AI narratives to try and use our distributed hive mind to collectively analyze the kinds of images that we've been talking about and generate some new ones. So if you are feeling creative, please do come and join us for the workshop. And if not, thank you very much for coming and enjoy the rest of CogX.